Thank you, Courtney. Thanks for the introduction. So today, I'm going to talk to you guys about the deadliest animal in the world, right? And so I like to start off by defining what I mean by that. And so what I mean is so essentially the animal that causes the highest number of human deaths on an annual basis, right? And so I'm not sure if you guys have read the synopsis for my talk or not, but assuming you haven't, I like to do just a quick activity I do with some of my students. And so I'd like you guys to think about, what pops in your head when you hear deadliest animal or deadliest animal in the world. And I'd like you guys to go ahead and talk to a peer or neighbor and share what comes to mind when you hear deadliest animal in the world. So you guys can go ahead and do that. Now I'm just going to listen to what you guys are talking about.
That would be a really good guess.
What do you think?
Humans.
What's that? Humans. That's a good one. That's a good one. We may do that. We may do that in a second. Okay, so let's come back together as a group. So I actually heard a number of interesting animals. Let's see if I can. There we go. Okay, so I actually heard a couple of that you guys can actually see up here right now. And so these are some really common animals that the general public thinks about when they hear deadliest animal in the world, right? So crocodiles, sharks, I heard sharks out there, scorpions, and so forth. But actually, of the organisms that you guys see up here, only one of them commonly makes a top 10 list if we actually consider the actual numbers of human deaths per year. And so I would like to go ahead and show you guys a typical top 10 list for the most deadly animals in the world, okay? And so this data varies quite a bit. These are really ballpark numbers, but the organisms that you guys will see up here are typical for a top 10 list, right? So on my top 10 list here, I have tapeworms, right? And so tapeworms can lead to roughly around 700 deaths per year, and so this is due to intestinal blockage and malnutrition. So a typical way of obtaining this parasitic tapeworm is through fecal oral route or even eating undercooked meat that have larval cysts of tapeworms. Okay. Number 9 are crocodiles. So here's a large animal. Here's one of two reptiles that I'll tell you guys about. Roughly around 1,000 people per year. Now, interestingly, the American crocodile is relatively docile compared to other crocodiles across the world. Right? So if we go to other places like the Nile Basin, the Amazon, Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia, people often live in much closer proximity to these animals and are much more aggressive, and we roughly see around 1,000 deaths per year due to crocodiles. Number 8, Ascarius. This is the most common roundworm parasitic infection in the world. And again, similar to the tapeworms, intestinal blockage and malnutrition lead to deaths, but 4,500 people die a year. Number 7, tsetse flies. Now this one is a little bit different than the previous 3 from the aspect that the tsetse fly, which blood feeds on mammals, doesn't directly cause death, but rather it is a vector for infectious disease, specifically for trypanosomes, right? And the trypanosome in question that the tsetse fly can transmit causes African sleeping sickness. So this is a major issue in sub-Saharan Africa, about 10,000 deaths per year. Number 6, triatomy bugs, commonly known as the kissing bug, although you would not want to get kissed by this bug. Commonly nocturnal, and it will actually feed on the face of an individual that is sleeping. And it is a vector also for trypanosomes. The species in question here causes Chagas disease, right? And so this is a major issue in South America, as well as Central America and Mexico. And within the last 10 years or so, southern United States, right, typically referred to as a tropical disease. There's actually a local transmission that has been documented in Texas, in the southern US, and this is really scary because most American doctors are not typically trained to look for transmission of tropical diseases here in the US, okay? But typically, this bug will burrow through tissue, including muscle, leading to heart failure. All right, number 5. Just like number 6 and 7, freshwater snails don't directly cause death, but again, there are an important animal that is part of the life cycle of a parasite, schistosomes, which is another type of parasitic flatworm. And they cause roughly around 20,000 deaths per year. What's that?
Where are those found?
These are found typically on the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. So far, of all the organisms I've talked about, none of these are a real issue in the United States, right? So that's a good thing. Number 4, man's best friend, right? Dogs. And again, not the dog itself directly, but as a vector for carrying rabies virus, right? About 3,500 deaths per year. And so at this point, I want to point out a interesting correlation that we have going on here. And so the last 4 organisms, animals, again, are not directly causing death, but they are vectors for infectious disease. Okay? Number 3 is our second reptile, snakes, venomous snakes. And again, in the United States, we do have venomous snakes, but again, they are generally not an issue. So maybe a handful of people die a year in the United States due to venomous snakes. And that's predominantly due to our healthcare infrastructure and access to antivenom. But again, in other areas in the world, especially tropical areas where there's a much higher density of venomous snakes and not much in terms of medical infrastructure where people don't access to antivenom, this is a real issue. Around 100,000 people per year. Generally, this is thought of as being very underreported. And at number 2, someone actually came up with this earlier in the crowd. Humans ourselves, right? Humans killing humans. About 500,000 people die due to human-related activities each year, right? So this includes war, political conflicts, displaced people, refugees dying due to starvation, and so forth. And so about 500 people per year. And so with that, again, assuming you guys haven't read the synopsis for this talk, I'm wondering if you guys can guess number 1. Your hint is that it is an invertebrate. It is actually an insect. So does anyone have any ideas? Mosquitoes, right? And so some of you guys may have read that synopsis. That's okay. So yeah, mosquitoes are arguably the most deadly animal in the world. Again, they themselves are not directly causing death, but they are a vector for infectious disease. The elephant in the room is malaria. Over 500,000 people die a year due just to malaria. And there are also vectors for other viruses, such as dengue fever, Zika, Chikungunya. We'll talk more about some of these other viral diseases later on in the talk. Okay? So with that, again, I'm Adam Kleinschmit, and for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on mosquitoes and tell you guys a little bit about what biologists have been doing in terms of tinkering with mosquitoes to engineer or modify a mosquito that can help reduce the transmission of infectious disease. And so first, I want to give you guys some more statistics to really provide the case that mosquitoes are a huge public health issue. And then secondly, I'll talk a little bit about the physiology of mosquitoes and how mosquitoes actually find a host. Once they found a host, how they blood feed. And then once they're blood feeding, how that transmission of infectious disease actually happens. And then lastly, I'll talk to you guys about some classic ways that humans have controlled numbers of mosquitoes in local populations. And then we'll transition to talking about genetic engineering and how this can be another tool for mosquito control districts to possibly use to control mosquito numbers, okay? So let me show you guys some more numbers. Again, just to emphasize how big of a public health issue mosquitoes present. Okay, so on this map, I'm just going to point out some common infectious diseases that mosquitoes can transmit. The big one is malaria, right? So about half of the world's population, about 3.2 billion people, are living in regions that are endemic to the mosquito that can transmit malaria, right? About 207 million people are actually infected by the malaria parasite through a mosquito bite each year. And so if you guys look at this map, you'll see it's color-coded based on where the mosquito vector is endemic in the world, right? And as I mentioned before, about 500 million people actually die due to malaria each year. Moving on, we have dengue fever, about 390 million cases per year, about 20,000 deaths. There is no vaccine for dengue fever at this point. West Nile virus, again, no vaccine. And this one hits a little bit closer to home, right? Since 1999, West Nile virus has been found throughout the United States, including here in Colorado and the San Luis Valley. Around 30,000 cases per year. We're talking about in the thousands for deaths. And then yellow fever, last one I want to mention here, 207,000 cases per year, about 20,000 deaths. There is a vaccine for yellow fever, but it still is a huge problem. There are reservoirs, other primates that can harbor this virus, and we still see it causing a lot of damage in populations, especially in Southeast Asia. Okay? I should say that this map really does not promote tourism here in Indonesia, right? But I can say I've actually been to Indonesia and I've come back unscathed, right? I've taken prophylactic for malaria, but again, it is a wonderful place, even though this map does suggest perhaps you don't want to travel there, okay? So hopefully you guys are blown away by these numbers. These are big numbers, right? But I do want to show you guys some additional statistics. So infectious disease from mosquitoes goes beyond just deaths and infections, right? So there is a socioeconomic cost to society that I want to focus on, right? So individually, individuals that are hospitalized due to these infectious disease there's lost productivity, right? So they're perhaps losing some of their income, medical expenses, transportation costs, especially if they need to travel for the appropriate types of medical attention. So just give you guys an example, here in the United States, West Nile virus is a huge deal from the infectious disease that I mentioned so far. And so in 2014, Barrett did a study where he actually followed 35 people that contracted West Nile virus. They all happen to be in Colorado, of all places. And he followed them over a period of 5 years and essentially averaged their medical expenses, right? And so essentially he wanted to get a ballpark number of how much Americans are spending in terms of healthcare costs related to West Nile virus. And so he took that average cost and extrapolated it to the number of known cases that have been documented for the United States between 1999 and 2012. Right, so over those 13 years, his ballpark number is around $780 million. And this is just, again, individual medical expenses and travel related to medical expenses. So about $56 million per year. Beyond the individual, our communities are paying for infectious disease by mosquitoes, right? So funding mosquito control and abatement programs, funding education and vaccination programs, loss of productivity in terms of the community, and then also potentially losing money in terms of tourism, right? So just think of Miami this fall with the Zika outbreak in one of the big tourist areas in Miami, right? This is a huge deal. So with that, Alamosa has a mosquito control district, right? And so just to give you guys an idea of how much money the public puts into preventing infectious disease, I'm wondering if you guys have an idea of what the annual budget is for the Alamosa Mosquito District. And I'll go like this or like this. So you guys can throw out some numbers. From my understanding, yeah, it's their whole program. So salaries, insecticide, adulticide. They use planes for some of their. What's that? It is a little bit lower than that. So it looks like it ranges from anywhere from $350,000 to $500,000. So this is their 2016 budget. But the point here is that this is essential for public health, right? But the point here is that in the United States, we're spending millions of dollars as a nation on just controlling the numbers of mosquitoes, right? So this is a huge deal. Okay. So let me introduce to you guys the most wanted mosquitoes, if you will, in terms of infectious disease across the world, right? So Anopheles gambia is the main species that can transmit malaria. Aedes aegypti is the major vector for a number of viral diseases such as Zika, dengue fever, Chikungunya, yellow fever. And we can actually find Aedes aegypti in the southern United States. And then Culex species, specifically Culex pipiens, is one of the main vectors for West Nile virus. Okay? That being said, I do want to say there's about 3,000 species of mosquitoes in the world. About 200 of those can be found in the United States. And there's roughly around 40 genera. Here you guys are just looking at mosquitoes from 3 different genera, right? So in terms of infectious disease, most mosquitoes are not a threat. It's really a select few species. There are additional species beyond the ones I'm showing you here, but these are the predominant ones that are transmitting most of the infectious disease, okay? So later on the talk, we'll talk more about Aedes aegypti, okay, in the United States. So with that, let's look a little bit more closely at how mosquitoes actually transmit infectious disease. Right, so here's a simple diagram. Imagine that this human is infected with West Nile virus, right? Let's say this mosquito blood feeds on this individual with West Nile virus, picking up the virus through that blood meal. As we'll talk about in a little bit, you'll see that mosquitoes will often blood feed more than once in their lifetime. And so if that virus makes it through this organism physiologically to the salivary glands, that virus can be transmitted if that mosquito blood feeds on another human, right, completing that cycle. Some infectious disease, like West Nile, are also found in other organisms. So West Nile is typically an avian virus, right? So mosquitoes can feed on birds, and then later on in its lifespan may feed on a human and transmit West Nile virus that way as well. Some of these other viruses are also are found in reservoirs that are other mammals, right? So there can be, these are zoonotic diseases, if you will. They can be transferred between different organisms through the mosquito as the vector.
So where did the virus start at in the first place?
Where did it evolve from?
Yeah.
It really depends on the virus, but a hot spot for evolution of viruses is Africa very broadly, in the jungles of Africa. But yeah, so maybe we can talk more about that. That would be a long conversation, but maybe we can talk more about that after the lecture. Okay. This is just a real generic transmission-based picture. Okay? So with that, turns out mosquitoes are predominantly vegetarian. Right? In fact, male mosquitoes are strict vegetarians. Right? They love themselves a nice meal of some sweet nectar from flowers. Right? So essentially nectar and water is their sustenance. Right? It's actually just pregnant females that blood feed. Right? So if you've been bitten by a mosquito, it was a pregnant female. Right? And so those pregnant females, essentially what they're looking for, they are looking for a high protein meal with iron to help rear their progeny, right? So most females will actually, they'll mate with a male and then they'll blood feed. There are a few species of mosquitoes that the females will actually blood feed first and then mate. And so that's what you guys are seeing up here. You guys are looking at a little bit atypical situation, but you guys are actually seeing two mosquitoes in the midst of mating. Okay? So again, these pregnant females are the ones that are blood feeding, and they can blood feed or essentially breed roughly every 2 to 3 days depending on temperature and local conditions. And these female mosquitoes are able to stay in this reproductive zone, if you will, for up to about 2 weeks, right? So they may blood feed 3 to 5 times in their lifetime, right? So if that first time they blood feed happens to be someone with West Nile virus, if it goes through their body to their salivary glands by the second time they feed, they can be transferring that infectious disease to another organism. Okay, so at this point, let's say a female has blood fed, right? And so this female here, most species will lay their eggs as a raft on a body of water. And so this is a female laying roughly around 300 eggs, right, per go. And again, females can do this 3 to 5 times in their lifetime over a period of 2 weeks. Okay? Those eggs will hatch on this body of water into larvae. Those larvae will feed in the body of water, metamorphose into pupae, and eventually those pupae will float to the surface where an adult will emerge. Right, assuming that's a female, and the female mates, it's going to be ready for a blood meal, right, completing that cycle. So, let's say a female has mated. It's looking for a host to blood feed, right? How does a female mosquito that's mated find a host, right? And so mosquitoes can detect a number of different factors. They can detect a gradient of carbon dioxide, right? So as we respire, they can essentially detect that gradient of carbon dioxide, fly up that gradient. When they're in closer proximity, they can actually use visual cues to fly closer to that host. And then they can also detect a thermal gradient as well as a gradient of moisture. And then lastly, volatile fatty acids from the oils that we secrete in our skin, they can also detect those with receptors. And that is thought to be why some mosquitoes seem to prefer some of us over others, right? And I'm one of those people they seem to prefer, unfortunately. So volatile compounds on our skin, so generally oils, so fatty acids.
If you're more oily, you're more likely for mosquito.
And it's really the composition, so we believe it's the composition of those oils, which can be dependent on diet as well as just the physiology of that individual. But yeah, they like me. They like me. Let me show you guys a brief animation, just really demonstrating this ability for mosquitoes to detect a gradient of carbon dioxide. Okay, so what you guys are going to be seeing here is some traces of mosquitoes in a wind tunnel here where there's no CO2. Notice that the mosquitoes are flying to the left and to the right. You can see the traces of where the mosquitoes are flying, which direction. And then in a second here, the next part of the video, they're gonna give off some carbon dioxide source to the left. And I want you guys to notice how the mosquitoes go crazy, and most of them are typically flying to the left, right? So they're detecting that carbon dioxide gradient, flying up it. And again, these are females that have mated. These happen to be Aedes aegypti, right? So a vector for Zika. Okay, so at this point, let's say a mosquito's landed on your skin, right? Pregnant female, and she's looking to blood feed, right? And so mosquitoes will use a set of mouth parts that we call a proboscis, right? This proboscis has a sheath around it called the labium that will retract as that mosquito will pierce the dermis or epithelial layers of the skin. And in blue here, we have some maxilla, which are like serrated steak knives, but miniature versions, right? So small that we can barely feel those serrated steak knives, if you will, ripping through our epithelial layer. At the same time, this yellow tube here, the hypopharynx, secretes saliva from the mosquito, and that saliva will actually lubricate these mouth parts, as well as help numb the area, so again, that we generally don't feel the mosquito penetrating through the skin. The mandibles here will actually pull away tissue that's been drilled through, if you will. So if you think of like a typical open body cavity surgery, those clamps that pull apart skin, that's essentially what those mandibles are doing as the mosquito's looking for a vein. Okay? And then lastly, the labrum is really like a straw. It's going to be actually sucking up the blood once this mosquito finds a vessel. Okay? So with that, let me show you guys a video where you can actually see predominantly the labrum looking for a blood vessel. Okay, so this thing is very thin, it's flexible. This is a anesthetized mouse that you're looking at with some microscopy. And this mosquito is, again, hunting for a blood vessel. Right, this whole time it's secreting saliva, and the proteins in that saliva include vasodilators that open up those blood vessels a little bit, as well as anticoagulants to help it blood feed. And at this point, you guys can see, hopefully you guys can see that the mosquito is blood feeding. And so this is where transmission of infectious disease can occur, right? It's really that saliva as that mosquito is feeding, where a parasite like malaria can move into the circulatory system of the host. Right? So this mosquito is feeding, and again, it's secreting anticoagulants through its saliva. And so in that saliva may be a malaria parasite.
So it's not actually the blood, it's the saliva.
Yeah.
That the parasite has to be able to live in long enough.
Yeah, so most parasites actually migrate from the gut of the mosquito after it's blood fed and migrate to the salivary glands. Malaria actually goes through a couple different life stages in the mosquito and gets to the salivary glands. So yes, it's not like those hypodermic needles, right, where there's blood on the needle. It's generally through the saliva. Yep. Again, generally mosquitoes are going to blood feed and then they're going to be done. Theoretically, if a mosquito was blood feeding and was interrupted and then blood fed again, there might be that possibility of like the hypodermic needle type transmission. But generally, it's through the saliva. Okay, so at this point, let me go through with you guys some typical ways of controlling mosquito populations that we've done for centuries. And then we'll talk about how genetically engineered mosquitoes may be an additional tool that mosquito control districts may consider using to control the numbers of mosquitoes. And specifically, I'll talk about how a specific genetically engineered mosquito will likely be piloted here in the United States within the next year. Okay, so how do we control mosquito populations? Right? Three big ways are education, reducing local populations, as well as personal protection. And so I'm going to go ahead and focus on the second one here, reducing local populations. Right? And so one of the main ways is through county abatement programs. Right? This is like the Mosquito Control Board that is actively reducing the number of adults with adulticide, reducing the number of larvae with the larvicide. You guys may have seen fogging trucks around Alamosa, especially in residential areas. Generally, these are spraying adulticide, where on contact, this chemical will kill adult mosquitoes. Okay? So two common ways that these abatement programs use to kill mosquitoes is through using adulticide through fogging, or using larvicide in bodies of water that they've identified where there is mosquitoes that are breeding. Okay? And so I just want to briefly go through advantages and disadvantages of each strategy. Right? So fogging kills adults quickly on contact and can reduce populations very quickly. But again, contact is required, possible human exposure, and at some level, one could argue is somewhat ineffective, right? And so to give you guys an example here, I'm showing you guys a route that a fogging truck may take through a local neighborhood, right? And so the green areas are areas where this fogging truck's going to have a hard time making contact with that chemical and the mosquitoes in question. So again, we're hitting lots of real estate in the fronts and sides of these yards, but again, we are not killing those adults in the backyards. Okay? Larvicides can essentially, again, is targeting larvae, which can be effective for weeks. But disadvantages is that it's hard to hit all of the sites, finding all those areas of standing water and so forth. And in some cases, depending on the chemical used, there may be some concerns with contaminating drinking water. Okay? That being said, this is a relatively effective way of reducing populations and is very important for public health.
So what is the result for human exposure? There's some real controversy about that in terms of fogging.
I don't know a lot about that. I would guess that it really depends on what chemicals the abatement program's using. And from my understanding, I'm guessing most abatement programs have a long list that they cycle through. But I'm guessing it really depends on what chemicals we're talking about. And I don't know a lot enough to really expand on that, though. Okay. One additional disadvantage I do want to point out about using chemicals, besides the fact that we're spraying insecticides, so it's not specific for mosquitoes, it's just kind of a broad way of knocking down insects, including the mosquitoes, right? Once you apply a chemical and apply it again, we have the chance of some of these organisms becoming resistant, right? And this is a huge issue with using insecticides to reduce mosquito populations. So let me just show you guys some data from the WHO. And this data is for Anopheles gambia, which is the vector for malaria, right? So not a concern here in the United States, but throughout the world, again, this is a huge health concern. And what you guys are looking at are confirmed cases of resistance detected against insecticides through testing areas throughout the world over a 4-year period, right? And so this is a growing concern relative to one of these tools to reduce mosquito populations. So at this point, I want to talk about genetically engineering mosquitoes and how this can be another possible tool that mosquito control districts may use in their repertoire. Okay? And the mosquito that I like to talk about is Aedes aegypti. And this mosquito can transmit Zika, dengue fever, yellow fever, as well as Chikungunya. These are 5 different types of viral infections. And we can actually find this mosquito in the United States. And so I like to focus again on implications for the United States. So, why focus on this specific species in terms of genetically engineered mosquitoes in the United States? Well, number one, this species is not native to the United States. It actually is based, so it's actually from Africa, but we can find the species throughout the entire world at this point. So they likely have migrated across the world through shipping routes. Unlike most mosquitoes, their primary host are humans. Also atypical for most mosquitoes, which typically feed at dusk and dawn. This mosquito will feed at any time during the day. And it's an urban mosquito. This mosquito loves the urban setting. It loves living in houses. So this is really a nightmare, right, for public health, considering that it's a vector for these different viral diseases. Okay. So let's look at where we can find this in the United States. So if you guys look at this lightly shaded region, you'll see that this mosquito, its maximum zone goes from the southern eastern seaboard all the way through the American Southwest, the southern tips of it. What I want you guys to focus on are these circles, specifically the bottom sector of these circles is indicating how abundant this mosquito is during the summer months, right, during the main wet season. And so essentially from Charleston or Augusta all the way down to New Orleans, these mosquitoes are in high abundance during the wet season. Okay? Another thing to point out here is that this dark maroon is indicating counties where dengue fever and Chikungunya virus have been documented as being transmitted. And so you guys can see that southern Florida and southern Texas have had recent cases of this.
What is the dotted line is it 2 different types of mosquitoes that we're looking at?
There are. In this case, they are looking at 2 different species of Aedes. So Aedes aegypti, let's see here, is the one that I'm focusing on. There is another species within this genus that can also transmit some of these viral diseases we're talking about. But Aedes aegypti is the main one in terms of its close association with humans in this urban setting. But this is another possible species that can transmit some of these viruses. One last thing I do want to point out is the size of these circles. The size of the circle represents roughly, it's focusing on Zika, but it's focusing on how many people are traveling internationally, coming from areas where Zika has been established. How many people are arriving at that locale coming from a Zika-infected region, right? And this is really the scary thing in terms of how easy it is to travel internationally these days, right? If there is a disease somewhere, it's going to be here at some point, right? And so imagine someone comes from Brazil where there's some local Zika transmission, and they come to Miami in July, and there's Aedes aegypti locally. Again, we can easily start a local transmission chain and have a small epidemic here in the United States. Right? So Aedes aegypti is in the United States. Okay? So let me go over the genetically engineered mosquito in question that it will likely be piloted here in the United States. So we have a British biotech company by the name of Oxitec. They've made this genetically engineered Aedes aegypti mosquito. And their goal is to use this mosquito to reduce the amount of local Aedes aegypti in a local population. Okay? So just to remind you guys, the life cycle of the mosquito, after a female mates and blood feeds, it will lay its eggs, which go through these developmental stages to eventually make more adults, which can further blood feed, right? The genetically engineered mosquitoes, the idea is to essentially release male genetically engineered mosquitoes to a local population, and which will allow them to mate with local females. These males have been genetically altered so that any of their progeny will inherit a gene that causes lethality, right? So whenever this released engineered male mates with a female, all those eggs that she lays that develop into larvae, they will not get past that larval stage. They will actually die. This male will live for about a week, and it will die of natural causes, right? So the elegance of this system is that these males that are released don't bite. They'll die after about a week, and any males they mate with, all those eggs, instead of developing into more mosquitoes, will die. Okay? So you might be wondering, well, how do we make these genetically engineered mosquitoes if they have a lethality gene in them, right? And so in the laboratory, there is an antidote, right? So we can feed these mosquitoes in the laboratory a specific concentration of tetracycline, an antibiotic, which will inhibit this gene from being expressed and leading to lethality. So we can grow up lots of genetically engineered mosquitoes, select just the males, and then release them into this region that we want to control or suppress mosquito populations. Okay. So Oxitec will essentially work with a local mosquito abatement program and essentially guide them with making transgenic mosquitoes on the premises. So here is a laboratory where they're actually breeding genetically engineered mosquitoes. And then they just want to release males, right? And so males and female pupae, there's a size difference. So we can essentially use a sieve and separate the males from the females. And then quality control, individuals can use quality control to go through and make sure that we just have males. Okay? And then Oxitec works with that local mosquito control board and sets up a plan where they go and actually release adult males that are going to breed with the females that are already there. And in this scenario, generally what they do is set up traps in the area that they're treating, larval traps, so they can monitor how many females that these transgenic males are mating with. Okay? So there's one other genetic modification that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is that these mosquitoes, the genetically engineered ones, have a gene that makes them fluoresce if a specific wavelength of light is shown on them. So after releasing those males, we can go check these larval traps later on and see how many larvae are being laid that have come from mating with a genetically engineered mosquito, right? And if there's more non-genetically engineered larvae than genetically engineered, they can change their plan and release more male mosquitoes in order to hit that sweet spot to reduce populations of mosquitoes. So here's some pilot results. Oxitec has done this in Brazil, the Cayman Islands, Panama, as well as Malaysia. Here's some data from Brazil. What you guys are looking at with this gold line are the number of larvae, mosquito larvae, that they are finding in traps after treating with these genetically engineered mosquitoes, right? Compared to the control, which is using conventional chemicals to reduce populations, right? And so the wet season is October through May, and again, compared to just regular chemical treatments, they're able to see essentially a 90% reduction in the number of mosquitoes in these treated areas, which is really phenomenal. And they've seen this again in all the areas they've piloted releases in. Okay. So, where does the United States come into play, right? The Florida Keys Mosquito Control District has actually been talking with Oxtec for about 5 years to possibly have a pilot study here in the Florida Keys, right? And in August, they actually got approval to do this by the FDA. Now, locally in the Florida Keys, there was some opposition to this idea of doing a pilot study of releasing genetically engineered mosquitoes. And so what the mosquito board decided to do was to have a non-binding poll added to the general election in November. Right? So essentially people in Monroe County, which includes the entire Florida Keys, as well as Everglades National Park, on their ballot, they had this question, this non-binding question: do you support the use of genetically engineered mosquitoes to reduce mosquito populations, right? And so overwhelmingly, this whole county, about 60%, right, was in support of using genetic engineered mosquitoes as a tool to reduce mosquito populations.
So what was the concern when people were saying, no, we don't want this? What was their expressed concern?
That would be a good question for some of those people. I'm just going to take kind of a, that's a hard question to ask. Some of it might be education, understanding of what exactly these genetically engineered mosquitoes are doing. But I think the idea at some level is the unknown, right? So what if this pilot study doesn't exactly work how it should? Is there some way that this synthetic gene can somehow get into a different organism? Something like that. So I think more or less the unknown.
So are there any known downsides to using genetically engineered mosquitoes that we know of?
In the pilot study so far, the data has been positive. We haven't seen any ecological drawbacks where, again, I mean, the elegant thing is that we're using males that don't bite, and then those males die after about a week, and then any progeny they make, those die as well. And so theoretically, they should not leave a trace, right? There are other methods or approaches to genetic engineering where a gene inserted into a mosquito can actually expand through a population and actually change what that population looks like. And that's a whole different beast, I would say. And so that's something that hasn't been piloted. There's all kinds of ethical questions and what could happen ecologically. Another thing is that this is targeted. So this is just Aedes aegypti, which is a non-native species. And unlike pesticides, where we're hitting all these insects, we're just strategically knocking down one species. But as I mentioned, Key West. Getting back to this, Key West, the local community where the pilot was planned to be held, they had a question, an additional question, again, if they lived in Key Haven. So Key West here at the tip of the Florida Keys. What you guys are looking at here is a small residential community called Key Haven. Part of it was going to be the release zone for the pilot, and then there was going to be a control zone where they just used traditional chemicals, and they were going to compare. And so individuals in this community overwhelmingly were against the idea of releasing genetically engineered mosquitoes. And so what the mosquito board decided to do was to work with Oxitec and the FDA to find an alternative location in the Florida Keys, not in Key Haven community. And so they're currently doing that right now, and they expect to have this pilot at an alternative location somewhere in the Florida Keys within the next year. And then more recently, Harris County in Texas publicly disclosed that they are currently in negotiations with Oxitec, the company that makes this genetically engineered mosquito, in March of 2017 on possibly piloting a release in this county, all right? And so Harris County includes metropolitan Houston, right? So stay tuned to see what happens in the news with Texas as well as the Florida Keys. So both these places need to go through the FDA, which may push this out, but Oxitec was pretty confident that they could get this rolling again within the next year. Okay. So, in conclusion, I just want to point out this idea that mosquitoes, right, and essentially 5 of the top 10 deadliest animals really don't directly cause death, but instead are vectors for infectious disease, right? And so there's other approaches to genetic engineering that I didn't have time to go into today, but that could be adopted for these other organisms as well. And these types of approaches would be to essentially insert a gene that does not allow that organism to be a vector for said disease. But that would essentially bring the gene into the population and change the biology of that population. And so there's some ethical questions that need to be answered before something of that sort does happen, okay? So with that, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions.
Do you have any, so like, you know, like the whole like balance of the kingdom, animal kingdom, and all that stuff, right? Like if you take out population or something, there's always like repercussions.
Yes.
Are there any repercussions for taking out the mosquitoes?
That's been a question that has been asked and put under a magnifying glass quite a bit. And there's 2 camps, right? Many scientists do not think that there'll be a huge change ecologically if mosquitoes are essentially taken out in terms of, you know, what depends on mosquitoes and the amount of protein that is in mosquitoes compared to other insects. That being said, like this approach that we're talking about here likely won't wipe out that species, even locally. It's really hard to do that. So like suppressing that population to 90% of its usual size is doable. But with this mosquito, it can actually, the larvae can actually stay in a dry spot for years. And then essentially when they get wet, they can hatch. So it's really hard to use this type of approach to actually wipe out this species.
Sorry, but I don't have this opportunity very often. So why is it that mosquitoes don't transmit other kinds of bloodborne viruses? Like HIV, like C, for instance?
Yeah, so it depends on the virus itself and so where it's derived from. And so HIV is derived from mammals. And also the physiology of the mosquito itself. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to more directly answer your question.
So I hadn't known about the saliva, so could it be that some of the viruses don't survive in the saliva and so then they don't get put back into the bloodstream? I don't know.
And yeah, so it may depend on receptors. So some viruses are very broad and they can essentially infect, if we just think of the human body, any cell, while some viruses are very specific, like HIV is very specific. That may be part of it. So essentially getting to the salivary gland may be an issue. It'd be interesting to look at the mechanism in more detail on how the viruses in question that we've talked about do get to the salivary gland from the gut. Likely through the hemolymph.
Do you think that like the kind of person being you're talking about, like the most effective way, like mitigate mosquito think that like getting rid of mosquitoes is like the most effective way, or like I think I recently heard they just like they're trial running the first malaria vaccination. Like, is this a do you think this is a better solution than like trying to go at other angles as far as like reducing mosquito caused deaths?
There's a lot of people in the field that are really looking at this as the solution. But this can be a very polarizing topic, right, which makes things difficult. Typical ways of preventing malaria, for example, there's a lot of holes, right? You need a lot of people in the population to get vaccinated, for example. You need people to consistently use bed nets, to use DEET-based sprays, and that's often hard to get a lot of people to buy in and do that, especially in some of the countries and regions where it's endemic. Over the last decade or so, the number of worldwide deaths has actually gone down from mosquito-borne disease. Most of that's malaria. So some of those numbers, peak at 1 million people per year, right? And right now, it's likely closer to that 750,000 people are dying from mosquito-borne diseases, most of those malaria. And a lot of it is reducing mosquito populations. But the question is how far can that go, right? So that requires a lot of prudence, people constantly monitoring mosquito populations. And so something like this, where we change the physiology of mosquitoes so they can't transmit, seems like the way to go. One question is, will mosquitoes evolve, or will there be some other organism that will now be a vector for infectious disease? That's another question that people have. If mosquitoes are no longer transmitting dengue, will some other insect evolve in such a way that they are now transmitting it? So, good questions to think about.
So, let's say this is successful, and they're able to deal with particular mosquitoes that carry like the Aedes mosquito. So we're able to do that, get rid of that, so we don't have that concern here anymore. One of the reasons we sprayed Alamosa is for West Nile, right?
Yep.
But really, they've been spraying in areas for mosquitoes, not for disease control, but because people don't like getting bit by mosquitoes. So even if this is successful, will they still keep on fogging and doing other types of abatement?
With this type of genetically engineered mosquito, this is something that you'd have to continuously release.
But it's particular, it's discriminatory, it only goes after a certain
One species?
type of
Oh, I see what you're saying. So we'll,
mosquitoes would survive, and they would be biting humans and giving you mosquito bites, which people don't like. And so would there still be this big cry to have abatement done, just to eliminate mosquitoes so people don't get bit, even though they're not going to get a disease from it?
yeah, that's an interesting question. I would assume these abatement programs, number one priority is public health. And then from that, like you mentioned, you get the added benefit of less mosquitoes in general biting, even if they are not the species transmitting infectious
I think
disease.
it's a good idea, because I don't think we should be killing all the mosquitoes off, because there are a lot of other species that need them and need them. And I kind of missed the question, the first question that came, maybe you talked a little bit about that, about what other species depend on mosquitoes for food? Because if we kill them all off, then we affect those species also.
Right. In total, some studies that have looked at, just made up, essentially calculated some rough numbers, suggest that the amount of protein that's in mosquito. So there isn't an identified species that relies specifically on the mosquito for its sustenance. But even if we go past that and just look at the amount of protein that's tied up in mosquitoes, and think about how big of a dent will that be if that protein's not there for other organisms. From my understanding, that's pretty minuscule compared to other insects on our planet. And so many scientists argue that they would hypothesize not to see a huge, who knows, but would hypothesize not to see a huge, anything ecologically major happen if mosquitoes are wiped out.
For some reason, I thought bats kill all mosquitoes out. That was one of the main foods.
Yes,
Is that not right?
they do feed on mosquitoes, but
They're not-
I'm going into a dangerous area here, but I would guess they are more broad in terms of insects in general, but they definitely do feed on mosquitoes, yeah. Cool. Well, I'll be happy to stick around if you guys do have other questions, but
So you'll do an update for us next year and let us know how this is working?
yeah, I could probably do that. And then there's something called a gene drive